Welcome to episode 5 of You All Meet in a Tavern. We're doing a little bit of remodeling around here, so please excuse the dust. In the last of our horror and gaming series for you this All Hallows Eve, we have Ari Marmell joining us to discuss some of our favorite horror role-playing games and settings, particularly White Wolf. We spend a lot of time talking about World of Darkness, but we also cover Ravenloft, Call of Cthulhu, and quite a few others. So grab a drink from the bar and take a seat, and we'll be right back after this word from our sponsor.
Hey, have you heard of The Strange? Hi, I'm Bruce Cordell. The Strange is a role-playing game that supposes that just outside of what we think of as normal Earth, there's an alien data network called The Strange. We're running a Kickstarter right now to fund The Strange. To find it, go to Google and type in The Strange Kickstarter and follow the link provided. The Strange is host to a number of hidden worlds called recursions that player characters travel to and explore. One is a place called Arden, where magic powered by souls and other fabulous sorceries actually work.
Bruce and I have designed The Strange to use the same rules engine as Numenera, a rules engine we call the Cipher System. If you know and like Numenera, you'll like The Strange.
This message was brought to you by Monty Cook Games. If you want to know more about The Strange, go to Kickstarter.com and search for us there.
So, you all meet in a tavern. Sitting in the dark corner is a man dressed all in black. Your host, Daryl Mott Jr. And to his right, as always, is Ross Watson.
Hello.
And joining us at the table today is Ari Marmell.
Hello.
Good to have you on board, Ari. Welcome to episode 5 of You All Meet in a Tavern. And today we're talking about horror RPGs. So it seemed like a really good idea to bring you on board for this particular topic. Ari, can you maybe tell our listeners what your gaming character sheet looks like?
As far as the actual playing, I've been doing that since I was 9, but we're not talking about that here. So I began freelancing for White Wolf in late 2000. Worked with them pretty steadily until 2004 and on and off since then. My most recent gig with them was actually on the new Mummy, but I've worked on both versions of Vampire, Masquerade, and Requiem, several of their other games. From there, I branched out into some D20 work for various companies, went from there to working for Wizards of the Coast, D&D 3rd and 4th edition. I'm still doing that on occasion, but for the most part, I've since moved into writing fiction.
What have you got out fiction-wise right now?
Well, at the moment, my focus has been on, I have the Widdershin series, which is technically YA fantasy, but it's YA and from Pyre books. The third one of those is coming out in just a couple of months, that'll be Lost Covenant. Early next year, I have the Mick Oberon series starting, which is basically urban fantasy set in Prohibition-era gangland Chicago.
Yeah, you were telling me about this in the interview we did, and it sounds really, really awesome.
I'm really happy with how it came out. It's an interesting voice to try to write in, with the slang and the speech of the period. You know, I'm really happy with it. I think it combines most of what I like. It's got fantasy. It's got some fairly dark aspects to it. I don't think it ever. Did
you get to write someone saying it's curtains for you?
I don't remember if I actually had curtains in there, but
sequel hook.
It's like this, see?
I believe the setup is Oberon's been expelled from the Sealy Court or something like that.
The character's name is Mick Oberon. He is, anytime he's asked about it, he refers to it being the third cousin on his mother's side to the actual King Oberon. He is an exiled noble from the Sealy Court who has wound up as a typical, almost stereotypical PI in Chicago.
Very cool.
I figured it was a good way of combining the classic noir tropes with the fantasy aspects.
That's very cool. Now, what's really interesting to me is, Ari and I have actually kind of worked together a couple of times, although in very removed fashion. First of all, Ari and I worked on the same book back in about 10 years ago now, Dawnforge.
Right. Yes. Wow.
Yeah, that's a blast from the past, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I still get depressed when I realize how long ago some of this stuff was.
Yeah, we both worked together on Dawnforge, and then more recently, Ari wrote the novelization for Darksiders 2, of which I was actually writing the in-game storyline stuff. So it was kind of a neat, almost parallel track there.
Oh yeah, no, I had a lot of fun with that, actually. I think the Abomination Vault is probably, if not the most fun I've had on a tie-in, then certainly top 2 or 3.
That's awesome.
Now, granted, I haven't written that many tie-ins, but I mean that in a good way.
So when we say, we brought you on board to talk about horror RPGs, you've got a pretty strong pedigree with that, don't you?
Yeah, like I said, I started off with White Wolf, a lot of Vampire, some Mummy, a few other things.
You kind of closed out Vampire the Masquerade in a way, didn't you?
I did. My first tie-in fiction novel was the Gehenna novel for Vampire, the final novel in the series. And I also did the opening fiction for the final RPG book in the series, also called Gehenna, confusingly enough. It was fun to work on. I would do a few things differently now, I think. No, I enjoyed closing that out.
Actually, that's a great segue to, maybe one of the first things we wanted to talk about tonight was actually, if you want to talk about horror RPGs, I think you absolutely have to look at one of the biggest, most influential studios in that line, and that was absolutely White Wolf. Wouldn't you agree?
I would, yeah. I mean, they certainly weren't the first, but I think they were the first to really tap into the zeitgeist of the gaming community at the time. The first really... I don't want to say it brought horror gaming into the mainstream, because that implies that there was a mainstream.
Well, at the time, it kind of did, because at that point in time, there was also a big resurgence in the goth community, and they really
tapping into that
it.
Subculture was huge.
Yes. So, I mean, yeah, I guess in a way they did.
That was Marilyn Manson T-shirts with big giant onks on them, as far as
well, it was not just that. It was Neil Gaiman's series about Sandman. There was a lot of stuff in the '90s that was kind of built into that whole subculture, and then White Wolf just absolutely tapped the keg and started pouring beers for everybody in the gaming industry.
I think White Wolf is I think probably one of the 2 or 3 biggest timing-related success stories in RPG history. I would say them and the explosion of D&D 3rd edition. Just really perfectly timed. I'm not saying the games weren't worth the success; they certainly were. But
I'd add Pathfinder to that list.
Okay, that's a fair point. But yeah, it's one of those things where it's just you have the good game that happens to come along at the exact right time. And it was really written in a different voice than a lot of RPG games were at that time, except for Thassa maybe was doing that sort of thing.
Not to the same extent. I mean, they were real. White Wolf brought a real sense of style that had not really been seen before in a lot of RPGs. They really kind of pushed that idea that the game mechanics were far less important than the telling of the story, and that the RPG model was basically a form of art. And I think this had been said before, certainly, but I think White Wolf was the ones that really kind of championed that cause. Oh, absolutely. I think one of the things that they did, and I enjoyed this as a writer, was the fact that so much of even the rule books were written first person in character. It not only added a great deal of flavor to the text itself and a great deal of feeling to the world, but it allowed us, even as the game writers, to sort of keep things unclear. You were never entirely sure if something written, even in one of the official books, is this the actual truth of the world or simply the truth as the narrator sees it. Yeah, the unreliable narrator is a fantastic trope. We used it all the time in the 40K roleplay lines, actually. We would say, well, here's something really cool we want to talk about, but let's not use the voice of authority. Let's have, some crazy guy make a report and then have some other person say, oh, that's total crap.
Yeah, exactly.
At the end.
And that was and that's exactly the parallel I was drawing with Thassa was the only ones that were really doing that at the time. And Shadowrun both came out about the same time. Vampire was... Shadowrun was 89, Vampire was 91. So
by 2 years, it beat it.
Yeah,
actually.
so they were really, really close together and both kind of doing the same thing. But Shadowrun was still in that mode of very, very heavy rules mechanic, focusing on getting your skills and your points and everything else. And Vampire really moved away from that to try to differentiate that. And it's had rippling effects all over the industry to the point where now we've got Fiasco, which is no dice other than setting up the story itself, and if you even count that as a role-playing game, which I do because you're playing a role. And then you've got Fate, which is just roll 4 dice, add your pluses and minuses, and a skill, done. And it's really, really moved to telling a story over playing a game in some cases with these role-playing games. And White Wolf really kind of kicked that off.
They definitely had a system. I mean, you can't just say that they were proposing diceless or anything like that. I mean, when we talk about LARPs in White Wolf, you can kind of go there.
Oh, sure. They didn't go diceless, but there was definitely the sense that story and character
mechanics were less important.
Yeah.
Their combat section was like 8 or 10 pages at most, I think, in the first edition Vampire rulebook, compared to every other game rulebook where the combat section's like sometimes half
the book. Right. No, what I was going to say is the thing about White Wolf's unreliable narrator, and the thing that a lot of other games picked up moving forward, is I would argue, and I know that there are games that don't do it this way to a greater or lesser degree of success, but I would argue that for the most part, that's absolutely essential to horror role-playing. And the reason why it was such a big deal when they first tried to do horror in D&D, like with Ravenloft, is the fact that horror requires an element of the unknown. It requires at least some sense of, I don't know what I'm dealing with. That is the antithesis of a system-heavy role-playing game.
Well, you've got a point, Ari, and I'm not saying you don't, but I do think I disagree slightly with that.
Okay.
I mean, we're gonna cover later probably in the podcast talking about Call of Cthulhu, but for example, the sanity mechanic in Call of Cthulhu is a strong feature of that game, and it is basically a defining, I would say, feature of playing and the experience of playing Call of Cthulhu.
Oh, I would not argue with that, no.
So in a sense, I would, for the most part, I agree with you that, the unknown is really cool, and we should not try to, capture that mechanically. But at the same time, I think there are some games with some specific mechanics that work really well for building horror.
Oh, sure. No, I'm not saying that horror can't have mechanics at all. I'm simply saying there has to be an element. With Call of Cthulhu, I mean, you're dealing with these Lovecraftian elder horrors. They are
the unknowable from beyond the stars.
Yeah, it's kind of.
But they do have stats.
Until and unless you begin statting out everything in detail, and even then to an extent, it's pretty much that unknowable is built in. When you're dealing with, as White Wolf coined the phrase, more personal horror, when you're dealing with you are the monster, you are the vampire, the werewolf, the whatever. When you're dealing with you have the perspective of the monster, and it's also a monster that is much easier to comprehend than Lovecraft's.
Yeah, it's relatable horror, not cosmic horror.
Yeah, then it gets to the point where, well, if I'm playing the monster and I know absolutely everything about it and about the world, well, yeah, I can still roleplay it where I'm trying not to be evil, but it's not really horrific. Or at least it's not as horrific as it could be, let me say.
Well, we've kind of drifted into this topic, but I just want to clarify. We're basically at this point talking about what White Wolf did right.
Yes.
And I think they did a lot of things very, very well, very, very right, if you will. And you hit on one of them, the idea of personal horror, and that was something that they carried through as a theme, I think, fairly strongly in all of their products. Personally, my favorite of their game lines was Werewolf the Apocalypse. I just loved everything about it. And if I had to say one of the things I thought was, the most right or the most interesting about, say, Werewolf, they built up this really cool idea of the, cosmology, the spirituality of the Guru, and how that worked with their culture and their beliefs. And this all kind of tied back into the actual game mechanics and the way that you played the game and the experience of the game, because it promoted the idea of everyone working together as a pack within a sept, which was their larger group. So it was a cool in-world thing that was about playing monsters, but it was also about playing different monsters working together, and they very elegantly tied that all together, in my opinion. That's one of the reasons why Werewolf is one of my favorite of the was absolutely my favorite of the White Wolf lines.
Oh, I would agree. The White Wolf games, for the most part, well, we were just talking about how story trumps mechanics. I know that in D&D, for instance, while there are some groups that'll do it, for the most part, you don't really want a group adventuring together where one character is 5 levels lower than the other. It can be done, but it's not optimal. With the White Wolf games, I think there's much more of a sense of, if the story throws these characters together, they can find a way to work together and be effective in the course of the story, even if they are dramatically different, or even dramatically differently powered mechanically.
Dungeons & Dragons is a class and level system, and it's always going to run up against that when you compare it to a much more open advancement type game, a very broad open advancement game like Werewolf or like Shadowrun, for example.
Sure, absolutely. I was going to say, I'm just pointing to the new Mummy the Curse. There's a number of models for how to put together a group for that game, and the idea of all the players playing mummies is actually listed as one of the least frequent models. The idea of a mummy and a number of human cultists, while there's obviously a big power discrepancy there, is the one that makes the most sense in the game world.
Yeah, okay, I can see that. While we're talking about this, I think one thing I should really also mention is just how beautiful those early books were. They had the Timothy Bradstreet art.
Yes.
They had those, if you look at the cover, I mean, just the cover for Vampire the Masquerade, it's like the perfect cover. The covers for the original Mage book, the cover for the original Werewolf the Apocalypse, those 4 claw slashes on it. I mean, I was like, looking at that, like they really cemented some of that early graphic design and trade dress appreciation that I have today. I was just like amazed at how well those books looked and how it tied the line together. I mean, you could instantly tell that was a White Wolf product,
Yeah, because they really brought that aesthetic across the board, where each game kind of fed into each other in terms of having a cohesive aesthetic over the entire World of Darkness, but each different game had its own unique feel at the same time that was still very cohesive, both in art and layout and everything else. And that artwork and that layout and everything else came together to create this theme, the style for the game that really informed everything about it, which is another thing I really, really liked about it. But I want to go back to something else that Ari said earlier on, the voice and the in-character narration of a lot of the game book material. One of my favorite things ever, the thing that really hooked me on Vampire, aside from the fact that I was knee-deep in watching The Crow and Vampire, Interview with the Vampire and all that stuff at the time, was when you go and read about the clans, not only does it have a description of the clan from a clan member at the very top of it, it has each other clan in that book's opinion of that clan. From a stereotypical viewpoint, and it really gives you a window into the world and how these different clans interact and clash with each other.
I just want to say, as sort of as a brag, I have some framed sketches by Josh Timbrook, who was one of the early White Wolf artists for both Vampire and Werewolf.
Nice.
You may know him as the guy that drew the big werewolf on werewolf fight in the combat section of the original Werewolf the Apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so yeah, I'm a big appreciator of the artwork and the view, and like Daryl, I also thought that the in-universe things that they did with a lot of their entries were very, very cool. Knowing how the other clans thought about you, or knowing what the other tribes thought about you, those were things I thought were really neat.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, obviously you can take it too far. There are a lot of people who would say that by the end of the Old World of Darkness, the meta plot had kind of snowballed out of control.
Well, that's a nice segue into maybe talking about what didn't work so well.
Well, I would say that at least for some people, I enjoyed the meta plot sort of as its own thing, but I didn't tend to want to take it into account in most of my games. Okay, I'm trying to think of how to put this politically.
Well, since I've got no horse in this, I'll go ahead and go first while you try to figure out a way. The meta plot problem to me was they went too far in defining everything anytime they put out any sort of splat book. If you pick up it's like the New Orleans book, it sits there and defines everyone in that city and their personalities and character sheets, and you're like, okay, why would I want to play there if everything's already set in canon? My players can't really have any effect on anything. The Justicars are already set. The Prince is already set. We already know all this stuff. How are they going to interact with these characters? And sure, you can do that, but it also kind of...
You're talking about the concept of white space, that there really wasn't, areas set aside for players to sort of tell their own stories.
Yeah, and a lot of those, and it seemed to go across the board. You can name a city, and someone somewhere, it doesn't matter what city you picked to play in, that one person at the table who has every single book and's read them backwards and forwards is going to say, "Oh, well, actually, the Justicar in this city is such and such."
Well, the thing I would say about the meta plot, and I will say on our side of it, there are certain things about meta plots in general that are really cool, and there are certain things about White Wolf's meta plots that were really cool. But at the same time, what I think is the issue with the meta plot is that the game book sort of the core book gives you an idea of what the experience of the game is supposed to be like. What I like to call the adventuring paradigm. What are we doing as these characters, right? Like Werewolf is a very strong adventuring paradigm. You are Garou, you're fighting against the worm, typically Pentex, and that's basically your storyline, right? What the meta plot would do, though, is it would kind of come in and it would mess with some of those basic assumptions to the point where if you went to a Werewolf game, maybe for the first time, or I'm just using Werewolf, but it could be Mage, could be Vampire. Maybe Vampire is the best one. But if I went to a Vampire game for the first time, I would kind of have to spend a little time talking to the GM and say, well, okay, are we doing the typical Vampire thing, or are we doing things that are affected by the meta plot? In my opinion, it changed. It removed some of that accessibility, and that's all I'm going to say about that.
No, I think that's a very good. That's a good way to put it.
And I will point to episode 3 where Ross tells a story of him at a LARP where he's having a good time for an hour or two, and then all of a sudden a card drops at his feet that says "Satchel Charge," and kills his character. So he tells the whole story in episode 3 of the podcast in our Gaming Horror Stories.
White Wolf LARPs are a totally different conversation,
Yeah.
So let's just focus on the role-playing products right now.
So, I did a lot of work on both the old and New World of Darkness, both versions of Vampire, and they both have their strengths. But I think that the new one, I think Requiem, I think we did a little better about leaving some of that white space. Even for things that were defined, they were defined not as tightly, and they were defined as a lot more as, here are options and examples, as opposed to the way things are, capital A. I know that with the metaplot in the old World of Darkness, and this is what I was trying to get to earlier, is White Wolf had a lot of really good fiction. It also had a lot of not-so-good fiction. But
that's a good way to put it, yeah.
The fiction and the metaplot of the rule books were one and the same. What you wound up with was a lot of circumstances where, in the quote-unquote official game world history, and this is what Daryl was saying, all this important stuff was done by named NPCs. It didn't leave room for the player characters to actually shape things. I remember, and you'll have to forgive me, a lot of the details escape me at this point. White Wolf did a series of did a vampire chronicle which began back in the Middle Ages. There was a story and adventure, if you will, that took place that heavily involved the clan Giovanni. And the way it was written, the PCs, the players, spent the bulk of the adventure's climax tied to chairs, watching as NPCs did stuff.
That's not a very good sign.
Yeah. And there was some great stuff, even in that book. There was some very atmospheric stuff, but this is where story over mechanics can actually be taken too far.
Yeah, because we're still supposed to have a good time, right? We're supposed to be the agents of our own, sort of change, trying to tell our personal stories.
Exactly. The game writers have to remember that no matter how heavy the metaplot, no matter how structured is the polite way to put it, railroaded is the impolite way to put it, the adventure might be.
Choo-choo! All aboard the plot train!
Yes, we are still writing a framework for somebody else's story. We are not writing our own story.
The player character should always be the star of the story. They are the main characters, not the supporting players.
Well, if you can't... I think if we talk about White Wolf metaplot, I think you cannot not mention Samuel Haight. Am I right?
They did eventually learn from that and kill him off, but yes.
Yeah, but I think we have to, if we're going to talk about White Wolf metaplot and what went wrong, I think we absolutely have to at least brush over this topic.
Okay, I'm not familiar with this one off the top of my head.
Ari, do you want to field it?
You're welcome to. You brought him up.
Okay, so basically, White Wolf introduced as part of its meta plot, and I believe this was mid to late 90s. No, it was early 90s.
It was earlier than that. It was
earlier, because I was in college. Anyway, point being, they introduced this guy called Samuel Haight, and originally I believe he was a werewolf villain, and he was a kinfolk who wanted to become a real guru, so he ended up doing this ritual where he stole a werewolf pelt and put it on and became a skinwalker, where he was like now I'm an actual guru now. But that wasn't the extent of his story. I mean, if it had stopped there, it probably would have been really cool, but it didn't stop there. And Samuel Haight started showing up in all of the other game lines, and he started stealing powers and things like that from all of the other supernatural creatures that were out there. So he'd show up in Mage, and he'd show up in Mummy and things like that. I mean, to be honest, I'm not like a super expert on this, and I'm kind of paraphrasing in a lot of ways, so Ari, if I get it wrong, please step in.
I'm only familiar with the overall details myself. Yeah, he kind of wound up as...
He went around making a nuisance of himself in all of the game lines.
He made a nuisance of himself, and I think at various points he was almost every single type of
yes.
of supernatural.
He gained the powers of like all of them, and it became this... to me, it was like a running joke. I was like, oh god, what book is he in now? But
the Elminster problem.
No, it was more than that, because he was a bad guy, and you were supposed to fight him, but you weren't supposed to win.
Mm-hmm.
Does that ring true to you, Ari? That's the way I remember it.
That's more or less.
And that was the thing where I thought, it's kind of like, this is the antithesis of fun. This is a recurring bad guy who breaks all the rules that the player characters have to abide by. I mean, you like, literally, it's telling you he has to be able to escape. And I'm like, I don't like it. It was to me, it was like the metaplot authors had their own pet NPC, and they were kind of, forcing me to put him in my game. So I wasn't too thrilled with the whole Samuel Haight thing, and I know that I was not alone in this. I think, Ari, what was the reaction to this metaplot that you remember?
My memory is that, and I should know this, unfortunately, but it's been a while. I don't recall if this is something that actually happened in one of the game books, or just something that sort of developed on the forums and took on a life of its own. But I remember there was a point where people were talking about how he had finally been killed, and his soul wound up in the underworld from Wraith the Oblivion, and he was basically soul sculpted into an ashtray.
Yeah, I'm reading right now the wiki online, and that is. But before that, he fought like a Methuselah, and like had become a mage, and just, I'm like, Jesus, like everything he could have possibly done, to sort of make a nuisance of himself in all the other books he did.
Yeah. But no, I remember this. I remember
because he was a ghoul too. Apparently, I mean, geez.
Yeah. But no, people definitely celebrated his demise.
So yeah, he was not popular. So that's an example of the metaplot that White Wolf did going really wrong, I would say.
So if we're talking about things that I feel that White Wolf didn't do as well as they could have, and this is not a popular opinion, and I'm going to have some people yell at me for saying this. Mage, the entire game,
like in general, yeah.
Mage, the now this is not a problem in the New World of Darkness. The new version of Mage solves this problem for me. It has its own problems, but it solves this one. But in the Old World of Darkness, Mage the Ascension, it was a great game. I thought it was a fantastic game. I enjoyed the couple of times I played it. It never for one moment felt to me like it belonged in the World of Darkness.
Send your emails to Ari Marmell at...
It was... I mean, here's this world where you're dealing with vampires and werewolves and all this horror stuff, and the Mage game, I mean, yeah, there were a couple of traditions, the verbena and whatnot, but for the most part, they moved away from... It didn't feel a cult. It didn't feel...
Well, I could say this. My mage character was a son of Ether, and I was sailing my steamship around the rings of Venus, so exactly. I didn't really care what vampires and werewolves are doing.
Yeah, but that's the thing. It's a perfectly good game. That is a perfectly... I would love to play in a game like that. but it's not a World of Darkness game.
And I think the reason why I'm going to say I don't agree, but I'm also going to say I don't agree out of ignorance, because I really tried to get into Mage the Ascension, but no one around me wanted to play it. So all I ever did was read the rulebook like once or twice. But I read some of the Mage novels, and the Mage novels fit in well because they had good authors who were controlling all the characters and everything in there. But I can completely see what you're saying, because if you get into, was it the Technocrats?
Yeah.
Technocracy, yeah.
Yeah. They really didn't feel it, because every single game had their enforcing the, not the Masquerade, but enforcing the Masquerade using the TV tropes definition of it, where the regular people don't know what's going on. Vampires self-enforce the Masquerade. The werewolves had delirium, and so on and so forth. And Mage we have this one group of people that just go around and shoot you in the face with guns with no recoil and make no sound.
Well, let's make one thing very, very clear right now. I think we all agree, Daryl, Ari, and myself, that we are not doing. We want to say first and foremost, we are all fans of White Wolf, and we're fans of their games. We are doing, we're kind of analyzing what went wrong, but we're doing it from a clinical perspective. We're doing it from, an analyzing perspective. We're not saying we hate anything. There's no hate here.
Oh no,
we're just saying, yeah.
I would play a game of Mage to the Ascension today. I just would want it to be its own thing.
Right.
Yeah, the way when I brought up this to Ross earlier also said, this is akin to diehard Star Trek fans talking about whatever the new movie or TV show is, or the old shows, and saying, okay, this is what this problem is, but wasn't this part awesome, and this was awesome, and this was, we love the Borg storyline, best of both worlds, but we still have a problem with the naked now.
Well, I'll go so far as to say I think Ari's onto something with Mage. I mean, as I pointed out, the Mage character I thought was the most interesting to me was the one that basically left all of the World of Darkness behind. And I always did feel Mage was a little, kind of off on its own. It didn't really interface very well with the rest of the World of Darkness. But honestly, though, I think that book was actually eclipsed by a much more larger missed opportunity, a much more larger failure to grasp exactly what we're talking about. I'm going to go out and say I think Wraith is possibly the worst core book for the old World of Darkness ever published.
Okay, well, thank you for taking the pressure of the emails off me.
Yeah, this is me, and I will explain. Again, I'm not. I want to say again, I'm not slamming White Wolf in general, but I'm saying I think, okay, for me, and this is why I feel this way. You look at Mage, and it's a game about playing wizards, and they go around casting spells because that's what wizards do. And you look at a game about vampire, and it's about playing as a monster who sucks blood, and it has a lot to do with personal horror, and that's what it says on the cover. And Werewolf is a game about playing werewolves. Wraith, though, is a game about playing ghosts that has little to nothing to do about haunting people. And that's where it breaks down for me. I was like, wait, what?
I'll tell you the one thing that always put me off of even really trying the game out was the mechanic where, oh, hey, the guy sitting across the table from you can take over your character.
Well, the idea of the shadows, I think, was actually a pretty cool thing, with the idea that someone else is playing your dark side. I got into that as an idea, as like a mechanic.
It's a cool idea, not with the people I play with.
Well, okay, but fair enough. But here's really my problem with it, even more so than that, is that what it says on the cover is you get to play ghosts. And then when you read inside, it like actively punishes you for trying to haunt the real world, for having anything to do with the real world. Because there is this big monolithic organization that runs around like taking ghosts and turning them into things. And if you don't have the skills to protect yourselves from those people, which of course that's where all your points would go if you actually wanted to haunt people and, be a ghost. It would basically screw you, and you'd be screwing your whole party by not,
Because I'm thinking about it, because I read the Wraith novel, the first one that came out, and I'm like, it's just dawning on me right now as you're saying this. I'm like, yeah, that entire plot wasn't about I got killed and I got murdered, let me go get my revenge from the hereafter on the person that murdered me, which is the stereotypical ghost story from the ghost perspective.
Who killed me? I want to know. Why?
It was about two ghosts fighting each other. It was, he's a new ghost and he's wearing the robes, and then there's this other ghost that's in power.
So I'm curious to hear what Ari thinks about my experience on that.
My experience with Wraith is fairly limited. I didn't get a chance to play it much. I didn't get a chance to go much past the initial core book. But yeah, it struck me, from what I read, it struck me as though it would very likely fall into the same category for me that Mage did, which is a good game on its own, but not a part of the World of Darkness, and not really the equivalent of Vampire or Werewolf or whatnot. That it wasn't, as you say, it wasn't a game about playing ghosts. Not really. It was a cool game in its own right, for its own thing.
Well, there were certainly things about it I liked, like the idea of the feathers and the shadows. Those were really cool.
But no, I agree that it wasn't exactly what it said on the tin.
Well, a good friend of mine is Harry Heckel, who used to work at White Wolf, and he has some stories to tell about those days. According to him, the creation of Wraith was during one of Mark Reinhagen's most difficult periods. And I would say that rumor, I mean, I don't know if that's true or not, but it certainly seems like it's plausible based on the content of Wraith.
I can't speak to that. I actually only met Mark personally years after he was no longer with White Wolf, and I had moved on mostly to fiction, so I can't really speak to anything behind the behind the scenes motivations of anything that's not a lot more recent than that. I don't know where or how anything happened as far as Wraith is concerned, and I want to stress again, I think it's a perfectly good game. I just don't think it's what the ghost. It's not what the Ghost chapter of the World of Darkness should have been, in my opinion.
Well, I definitely agree with you on that. Well, I think this actually leads to something else. I think we want to backtrack a little bit to the idea of the metaplot. And one book that you absolutely have to talk about when you're talking about metaplot is Dirty Secrets of the Black Hand. And you know why, don't you, Ari?
I can answer that question in a couple of different ways, yes.
Yes being one of the two ways?
No, that...
So, for those of you who may not know... Go ahead.
That book is a really good example of what I was just saying about books where, there are some things in it that I really like. And there are some parts of it that there's a reason that we, and by we I mean the writers, kind of shoved it aside and ignored it after the fact.
Well, it's a very entertaining book, but I can see why you would want to sort of sideline it. For those of you who may not know what we're talking about, Dirty Secrets of the Black Hand was a source book for Vampire the Masquerade that got into the secrets of this organization in Vampire called the Black Hand, who are these assassins, basically. They work for the Sabbat. Is that right, Ari?
Well, it is and it isn't. The Dirty Secrets book was talking about the Black Hand. There was some bigger organization that wasn't part of the Sabbat that was actually behind the portion that was part of the Sabbat.
Yeah, it's very complicated.
Well, yeah. No, there was a later book on the Black Hand that did focus specifically on the Sabbat faction that was that was much better, and I think much better integrated. Let's say.
Well, the point where 36 to Black Hand kind of ran off the rails for a lot of people is that, according to 36 Secrets of the Black Hand, one of the popular vampire clans, apparently all their powers have to do with like changing their shape and their flesh and things like that.
The Shemisi, the clan.
Yes, yeah. That's the one. And according to Dirty Secrets of the Black Hand, that is due to the fact that they're all aliens.
Oh, God.
No, I'm not making this up.
Oh.
And Ari, am I right or wrong? Is that basically what the book says?
I missed this part. Why?
That is true in a very broad sense. As I remember it, it wasn't that they were aliens exactly. It was that their shapeshifting, the discipline of vicissitude, was effectively an extra-dimensional, semi-spiritual alien entity that was sort of corrupting the vampires it was spread to from within.
Oh.
And that falls into that again. That is something that could make for a really interesting story, taken isolated by itself.
Because I'm like, I can see how that might work, and it's, again, going back to a Lovecraftian sort of way, but that doesn't fit the theme of World of Darkness whatsoever. To me, anyway.
Yeah, because it's the world of darkness, not the dimension of darkness, right?
I mean, it's one of those things where you can do some fun stuff with it, but it definitely fits better into the hey guys, here's an interesting idea you might want to use in your chronicle, as opposed to here's an official answer for the game's metaplot.
Well, yeah, and so the point is that that book is widely regarded as being a very unusual kind of outlier when it comes to the Old World of Darkness.
Because another book that drew a lot of controversy, I remember, was I probably have the wrong clan, but I know it was one of the clan books, and I want to say it was Giovanni. That drew a lot of heat to White Wolf. Is that the right one? I'm thinking of completely different.
Not that I can recall.
I think it was the first one they black bagged.
No, that would also have been the Shimizu book, I think.
Oh, okay.
Where the vagina dentata on the back cover. Or is that not what we're talking about here?
I don't know.
And we go from really classy Tim Bradstreet and these beautiful covers, and we go to that.
Yeah.
So.
And every one of these books, they had some good stuff in them, and they had some interesting ideas. I don't know how familiar either of you are with the Vampire the Requiem line, but
I am familiar enough with it to know that I kind of not interested in it.
That's
because it seemed like it took all the stuff that I wasn't a big fan of in Vampire the Masquerade and kept it and got rid of all the cool stuff I liked.
Well,
that's what it felt like to me.
I definitely want to talk about the New World of Darkness, but I think before we leave the Old World, I think there's at least one more book we ought to cover.
Okay.
Possibly the most infamous White Wolf book made. And I say this only based on, the number of threads I found searching the web, discussing it. But that would be World of Darkness Gypsies.
Yep.
Oh.
That is, and my apologies to Justin Achille if I am misrepresenting what he said, but as I remember it, that is the only book for whose existence Justin apologized.
And why did he apologize for that, Ari? For our listeners who may not be aware.
Okay, basically take every stereotype, every cultural and personal stereotype of gypsies that people have been trying to get away from for years, and build an entire book of powers and family groups based around those.
It's fair to say it's culturally offensive in some ways.
Yes.
Okay.
And I don't, I don't for 1 minute think it was ever meant to be.
We're not saying that. It's, we're unintended consequences probably, I think it's fair to give them the benefit of the doubt on that too. They weren't, intentionally saying, haha, let's, mess with the gypsies. I think they just forgot to do some basic due diligence on it.
They probably did their research on the culture and its history and built an entire what they thought was a fictional thing based on this, and possibly may not have realized that there are still, and they don't, Romani are still around. Because even the term gypsy is considered offensive to them, like a racial slur.
Yeah.
I'm thinking that's probably what might have happened. I have no clue if that's actually what happened, but that's pretty much the closest explanation I can think of for why anyone would do something like that, is just pure, complete ignorance.
And, the funny thing about that is, if you hop companies and go over to TSR at the time, you had the Vistani in Ravenloft, who were very obviously based on traditional stereotypical gypsies. But the difference there is we're talking about
a fictional land, first of all.
A fictional land in a game that is based on fantasy and cultural tropes, where they have also changed the names and the details enough that they aren't directly referring to somebody who's alive today.
Right. So it's like an influenced by, but it's not trying to make a statement about.
Exactly.
No, so I think that's all I really wanted to say before we moved on from the Old World of Darkness, was just to touch on on that particular book.
Well, I do just want to reiterate what you said before, which is that we've gotten to talking about the places where White Wolf went wrong, but that is for the most part a significant minority of the books. I mean, most of them really did. Even I'm not saying they were perfect, but most of the line really did build on what they wanted it to build on. I think if you look at the Old World of Darkness overall, just as a unit, it is probably thematically one of the most successful RPG worlds ever put out.
Oh, successful! You cannot. I don't think you can argue against it being one of the most successful. It was, and this is
both financially and creatively.
This is definitely something we're going to get into. But White Wolf,
yeah.
Was one of the giants in the industry, based solely on the Old World of Darkness.
Yeah, but I mean, even just in terms of a creative thematic level, I really think far more of the books held to the theme and mood than didn't. That's an accomplishment there. I just don't want it. I'm not sitting here slagging on the company that gave me my start. In other words.
No, we're not. That's not the purpose of this podcast at all. But
I think we've talked about 4 or 5 specific books in a line that had hundreds of source books. So
it's fair to say that White Wolf's missteps just happened to be very memorable.
Yes,
that's all. That's really the reason why we're discussing it, is because they were very memorable and in some cases influential. I mean, it's fair to say you can point to Gypsies as a good example of what not to do. You're right. A lot of their books were great, and I think I tried very hard to point out at the very start of this that I'm a huge fan of the world, Vampire the Apocalypse, and I just loved everything they did for it, with the exception of Samuel Haight. So yeah, we're fans. We're absolutely fans of what they did, and we're acknowledging that there were both great successes and some stumblings along the way. Which brings us, I think this is probably a great time to talk about, White Wolf had a pretty major shift in their game lines because they had tied everything together into one single overarching universe, which was called the World of Darkness. And they decided to bring that all to an end about 2005, was it, Ari?
Oh, I think it was a little before that. Was it 2003, 2004?
So in early 2000s, they decided to bring the Old World of Darkness to an end. And the goal was to wrap up all the basic storylines and then launch a new World of Darkness, which would allow them to reintegrate all of their basic ideas and functions while still allowing them more freedom to sort of take those things in new directions. Is that a fair way to put it, Ari?
I think that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
I also think it was along the lines of an edition change in, say, D&D, where they were also trying to fix some problems with the rules that had come up as well. That's why the generation thing was less emphasized in Requiem.
Yeah, mechanically, one of the neat things about the New World of Darkness was that they actually... Okay, so in the Old World of Darkness, you had Vampire, which was its own game, and Werewolf, which was its own game. And, everything was its own game, but they had ways to work together, but it was kind of a kludge. And
there was no game balance between editions whatsoever.
Yes, and that's what's going to happen when you create a bunch of different games that all kind of take place in the same universe. And I know of which I am talking, honestly, because 40K Roleplay followed the same basic paradigm. So the New World of Darkness, what they decided to do was they were going to create a World of Darkness role-playing game, and then basically create setting books for the same game for each of the original lines. So one of the first products of the New World of Darkness was simply called the World of Darkness, I believe, and it was the basic mechanics, it was the basic core system that they would then use as a foundation to build off everything else, which, in my opinion, was a very smart move.
And you could play that as a game unto itself if you wanted to play human protagonists.
It had the full gamut of, here's how you create the basic stock human character if you want to... And you can play those in the world. So sure, you're not going to be able to compete necessarily with vampires and werewolves and whatnot, but you can still... It's not nearly as big of a gap as there was in the Old World of Darkness.
Now, this caused quite a bit of controversy. And again, I'm kind of saying these things that we all know out loud, just in case our listeners don't. But this caused quite a bit of controversy in a number of cases, not only with some diehard fans of the Old World of Darkness, but I would say probably the biggest impact that it had was actually on White Wolf's LARPing community.
Oh, this was about the same time they had the Camarilla fiasco, wasn't it?
This is all kind of tied in with that, yeah. So there was this massive worldwide organization called the Camarilla, which was the organization of LARPers who played White Wolf games, primarily vampire.
And I'm going to step in for just a moment to explain. Anytime any word from World of Darkness is spoken by Ari or Ross, take their pronunciation over mine, because I learned these words in writing, and I mispronounce pretty much everything in that word.
Well, to be fair, I learned them in writing, too.
But you guys seem to be agreeing a hell of a lot more than I do.
I am not an expert pronunciator of White Wolf terms, so there you go.
In fact, Camarilla or Camarilla is a debate you still find online today.
But the point is that the Camarilla, or the Camarilla, whoever, they were this big organization, and they were vociferously opposed to changing to the New World of Darkness. So much so, and this is really important, because they were actually like a semi-official arm of the company in some ways, of White Wolf. And because they were so viciously opposed to this, they actually like disbanded the organization. Now, I'm paraphrasing, and there's a lot of subtle nuances and things here. You can probably look it up on Wikipedia to find out more of the story. But it's important to make a note that this was a big stone being thrown into the water, and there were a lot of ripples from that effect.
As I remember it, I was never heavily involved in the LARP or Mind's Eye Theater aspect of things, so I can't really speak to it with any authority. But as I recall, that is basically the upshot, yes.
And there was another big fiasco with that as well. I'm not sure about the timeline where it falls in terms of the Camarilla disbanding and whatnot, but around the same time, I think it was after it disbanded, because it was rebranded as an official part of White Wolf, as their official LARP community. And then after a little while, for the longest time, you paid membership dues to get your packets and whatnot, but there wasn't any sort of no one really enforced any sort of guidelines or payment on this. And then all of a sudden, White Wolf said, okay, if you want to run a vampire or werewolf LARP, any sort of World of Darkness LARP, and you take money from players in any way, shape, or form, you have to pay us a licensing fee now. And this included people who just, okay, if members want to donate some money so we can rent out this location for it, that would have been considered in White Wolf's view, for profit, so therefore you must give us a licensing fee because you're making money on our product. And it created a huge backlash, and they ended up backing down from that, I think.
Well, beyond the idea of that these things happen in the LARPing community, in the RPG world, you could tell that it was a New World of Darkness product because they changed the sort of subtitle. Like, it was Vampire the Requiem now, and it was Werewolf the Forsaken, and they had kind of abandoned those old subtitles so that you could definitely tell someone, we're running a Werewolf the Forsaken game, not a Werewolf the Apocalypse game.
And for many of them, there were substantial differences. I mean, they were definitely different games.
Absolutely. But there were, beyond just the name, there were many differences.
Although I will say that, Vampire the Requiem was the first one out of the gate. We were writing that concurrently with the people who were writing the core rule book. There was still some question as to how different things were going to be. So I do have to say I'm very proud of a great deal of Vampire the Requiem, but it is not as different from Masquerade as I would have liked it to be, given my own druthers.
Well, I'm curious, Ari. In what ways would you have liked it to differ more?
The primary example I bring up, and this is just one of those things where it would have affected both the mechanics and the story, which is why I use it as my example. The idea of clan weaknesses, which were a huge part of both Masquerade and Requiem. Like in Masquerade, the Ventru could only feed off of one particular blood type, or
Malkavians were insane, Nosferatu were ugly.
Yeah. I really wanted to not tie those to clan in Requiem. I wanted to tie them to disciplines. The more points you had in a given discipline, the worse that discipline's related side effect was.
Yeah, that would have balanced things a lot better, in my opinion, in terms of how the meta plotty sort of it seems more thematic to me.
I would have thought so. Just for instance, obfuscate, when you can turn invisible or look like other people. Well, maybe that's the power that, along with the power of changing how you look, that's the one where you also stop showing up in mirrors and that sort of thing.
Interesting.
And I didn't develop it into a coherent list. We never went that route. But that's the kind of change I would have liked to have made. Something that is...
Yeah, the enhancing strength gives you a short fuse.
Or something like that. Yes, exactly. And that is... I would have liked to have at least explored in that direction. But, it didn't happen.
Well, there were, as we've talked about with the Old World of Darkness, there were several books that were quite good in the New World of Darkness. And I'm going to pimp a couple of them right now. The 13th Precinct is a fantastic book. If you are a fan of doing things with police, like a police procedural, and introducing horror elements, it's a great book. And from people like myself and Jason Marker, and we just live and breathe that kind of stuff. 13th Precinct was a fantastic product. And then on top of that, I mentioned my friend Harry Heckel was someone I'd worked with a few times. And Harry was part of a project called Orpheus, which was a intentionally short game line for the New World of Darkness that is a really interesting take on... It's not only dealing with like the afterlife, but it's also kind of doing an X-Files kind of approach to that. And I would highly recommend anybody who's interested in looking at like some of the things that the New World of Darkness did right, definitely take a second look at Orpheus.
Okay, before we get too far into this, I need another round. Is everyone else okay? All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be right back after this word from our sponsor.
Hey, have you heard of The Strange? Hi, I'm Bruce Cordell. The Strange is a role-playing game that supposes that just outside of what we think of as normal Earth, there's an alien data network called The Strange. We're running a Kickstarter right now to fund The Strange. To find it, go to Google and type in The Strange Kickstarter and follow the link provided. The Strange is host to a number of hidden worlds called recursions that player characters travel to and explore. One is a place called Arden, where magic powered by souls and other fabulous sorceries actually work.
Bruce and I have designed The Strange to use the same rules engine as Numenera, a rules engine we call the Cipher System. If you know and like Numenera, you'll like The Strange.
This message was brought to you by Monty Cook Games. If you want to know more about The Strange, go to Kickstarter.com and search for us there.
And we're back at the You All Meet in a Tavern podcast, episode 5. We are talking to Ari Marmell, novelist and game designer for many different games, including quite a few for White Wolf, which happens to be the topic of discussion right now as we're talking about horror games tonight.
And one of the things I wanted to bring up, since we're starting to transition from Old World of Darkness talking into the new World of Darkness, is I said something earlier that I really want to explain. I said I wasn't that big of a fan of Vampire the Requiem. I want to make this clear right now. It has absolutely nothing to do with the game design or the game mechanics. They were light years better because the company itself and the game designers, in telling these type of stories and creating rules for this type of world, had over a decade more experience in doing so. So the rules were a lot tighter and a lot better and a lot more balanced. But one of the biggest problems I had with Vampire the Requiem was it took out something that I really, really loved in Vampire the Masquerade, which was, when I played Vampire the Masquerade, from the second I opened up that book and I read those clan descriptions, I'm like, oh my god, this is awesome. I can totally, and immediately I could read the clan descriptions from in character and read the mechanics and read what all the other clans said about them, and characters would just pop into my head. It's like, oh, I want to make a character like this. Oh, and one like this, and one like this. And I was making like computer hacker intelligent Brewhog, who is not, that's not a Brewhog thing. And so on and so forth. I was creating all these different ideas in my mind, and I couldn't get them onto character sheets fast enough. And when I read Vampire the Requiem, I was reading through the bloodlines and the, because they got rid of, clans weren't really clans anymore.
Well, no, they had clans and covenants. And then bloodlines were sub-clans, basically.
Yeah, and every time I would read it, I'm like, okay, that doesn't sound interesting to me. Next one. And none of them really resonated with me, and that's a personal problem I had with it. I know a lot of people who resonated with those clans and bloodlines and covenants a lot. But for me, it felt wrong. That's one of my biggest problems I had with Vampire the Requiem.
Well, I think with Requiem, you know, they reduced the clans from 13 to 5, and there are both good and bad things about that.
And it also seemed like the ones they kept were the clans that I didn't really like as much. The ones they cut got shifted over to Bloodlines, if at all. Bloodlines and expansions like a year later or something.
Well, and that's the thing, is if you're only going to have 5 clans, then each one has to be a much broader archetype. And that, again, is both and neither a good or bad thing. It works for some people, not for others. I mean, that's just a flavor thing. So yeah, there's certainly no reason why it has to work for everybody. What I am fond of as far as Requiem, and this goes back to what we were saying earlier, is that Requiem, especially beyond the core book, was more about giving the storyteller options as opposed to this is the official behind the scenes history or secrets or whatnot. I was saying that the whole Black Hand thing earlier with Clan Samisi would have been fine as here's an interesting idea you can do if you want to, but it didn't fit as an official.
This is the official word, yeah.
Well, in Requiem there is a group called Seven, which is vampires who hunt other vampires, and no one is entirely sure why. Well, they put out a 7 source book. What that source book is 3 different mini source books. 7 could be this, or it could be this, or it could be that.
Which is something that White Wolf had done previously with the Gehenna book.
Yes.
Which is you had 5 different endings, which, by the way, I loved that aspect of that.
Well, I think this is them learning, how to put in white space and to offer game masters options as to how to tell their own story.
Exactly.
Going back to my point, I love the rules in the game. They did you did a really, really, really good job with fixing a lot of, I don't want to even say problems, but fixing a lot of kind of soft areas of the original World of Darkness by tightening things up a lot in the new World of Darkness. It's just, my problems come pretty much solely from the theme.
And, lest anybody get the wrong impression, Ari is absolutely a great game designer. He's absolutely a great fiction writer. And both Daryl and I are fans of his work.
Oh, yes.
It's a real pleasure to have you on with us tonight, Ari. Thank you very much for showing. Yeah. So before we, get too far away, I mean, because White Wolf is kind of taking over the podcast at this moment, and there's a lot to talk about. If you want to talk about White Wolf, I mean, we could go on and on about some of their later game lines like Scion and Exalted. I mean, Exalted alone is probably worth a whole podcast. But let's instead, we've kind of talked about the old World of Darkness, we've talked about the new World of Darkness, and let's just wrap up, I think, with a brief discussion of where White Wolf is now.
Well,
it's on its path now, isn't it?
Yeah, White Wolf sort of is and isn't now at all.
A good way of putting it.
White Wolf, quite some time ago, was bought
CCP,
and White Wolf essentially became a sub-studio.
Yes.
And it was focused largely on Vampire MMORPG, which is still in production.
This was rather infamously announced by the CCP head of marketing at the time, Ryan Dancy, at a press conference.
Mm-hmm.
That hasn't come out yet, has it?
No.
Okay. I was about to say, I thought I would have heard something about that.
No, the MMO is still in production as far as I'm aware.
But eventually, for a while, CCP was still putting out role-playing game books for World of Darkness, but it really wasn't their focus.
And again, Ryan Dancy made this extraordinarily clear in a very infamous... I encourage you to go find it on the web somewhere, because it's kind of jaw-dropping for a marketing guy to say these things. But
yeah.
There you go.
What eventually happened is several of the old White Wolf guys formed Onyx Path, which is a new company, and licensed and or bought various games that White Wolf had owned.
Including, I think the newest is the Scarred Lands, is that right?
They just announced that, yes. They've gotten hold of the Scarred Lands setting for... It was for D&D. I don't know if it'll be D&D, Pathfinder, its own system this time around, but they do have the property back, yes.
I am so excited about that because I loved the Scarred Lands. I thought it was one of the coolest settings for Dungeons & Dragons 3.5. I really, really, really liked it. I liked just about everything about it, so I'm excited to see what happens with that.
I had a number of... I had a number of plot lines that I had hinted at in a book here and there that I never got to execute, so who knows, maybe...
Well, I really hope they get Richard Lee Byers to write some more fiction for the setting, because I really liked his trilogy.
So I think at this point it has been long enough that this is no longer needs to remain a behind-the-scenes thing, but...
Uh-oh. You heard it here first, folks.
There was supposed to be another Scarred Lands fiction trilogy, and I know this because it was going to be mine.
Oh, that would have been really cool.
Missed opportunity there.
What was it going to be about?
Well, that would require... probably more time than we have.
Okay.
But
what's the elevator pitch?
let me instead do it this way. Were either of you familiar with the Serpent and Flora trilogy of adventures that they published? It was the 3 modules.
Specifically.
Okay. Well, I had introduced a background character in the second one, Ilkuthra, the Autumn King, who was basically a druidic lich. The trilogy was going to involve him and certain secret connections to the Titans, and it wasn't going to quite cross the line into world shaking, but it wasn't going to be like a big event where the setting has changed forever, because I don't like to do that in tie-in novels. But it was about as close to that as you can come without actually changing people's campaigns.
Huh.
And I'm not going into a lot of detail right now for...
Because you might actually write it again?
Well, I don't think it's likely I would ever write the trilogy of fiction, but I might be able to revisit the story concepts.
Cool.
If I end up working on Scarred Lands again, and if the people involved are listening to this, you may take that as a hint. But no, the other reasons I'm not going into it is, one, because it would involve... explaining to a lot of the listeners a huge chunk of the Scarred Lands background, and 2, frankly, it's been almost 10 years, and I don't recall all the details.
Oh yeah, well, that's fair. I after we talk about White Wolf, you were right. It's basically gone, and Onyx Path is sort of picking up the torch and moving forward with it. But it's kind of like nowadays we have a FASA company in 2013, but it's nothing like the FASA of 1993. I feel like, as gamers, we should all be aware that a titan of the industry has passed on. That this, I want to say a monolithic feature of over 20 years of gaming, and it's kind of gone. And I feel that absence every year. I go to Gen Con and I look for the White Wolf booth, and it isn't there. I feel that absence, and it's something that I think we as our role-playing gamers, we need to kind of remember what it used to be like when that was when you had certain tiers of gaming, and of course Dungeons & Dragons, Wizards of the Coast, they were the top tier, and right below them was White Wolf, and that was true for many years, for over 2 decades.
Pretty much all the 90s and a good chunk of the 2000s.
Yeah, so it's like I said, I definitely I feel their absence. And I hope that I am not alone.
Oh no, definitely not. I hope Onyx Path can take up a good chunk of that. I know that, like I said, the Onyx Path guys are some of the old White Wolf guys. So, as you say, the titan of the industry is gone, but it's it does actually have offspring.
Well, yeah, it's and I'm not saying that we're never going to see more World of Darkness.
Oh,
we
sure,
obviously
sure,
are.
Sure.
We obviously are, with Werewolf 20-year anniversary. I just picked it up, and it's gorgeous. I love it.
And that brings me to one of my points of Onyx Path. Onyx Path doesn't feel like a game design company yet. It feels like they're still building.
Yeah.
Because almost all of their releases at this point, with just a couple of exceptions, such as, I believe, the Mummy game that you worked on was original, that just came out, last year, I think, or this year?
It came out this year.
This year?
Earlier this year. But
beyond that, pretty much what they're doing is, here's a Kickstarter for a reprint, a 20th anniversary reprint of Vampire the Masquerade, of Werewolf the Apocalypse, of Mage the Ascension, and
third edition Exalted, for example.
They did a lot of reprints to get started, But no, Mummy is a completely brand new game. I mean, it is far and away different from with the possible exception of Changeling. I don't know if there is another game where the New World of Darkness version is this different from the Old World of Darkness version.
I covered that for the site when it was a Kickstarter, and just reading the description sounds entirely different than the original Mummy.
And I need to give props to the primary game designer on the new Mummy, C.A. Suleiman. He really came up with something different. Now, that may also make it more of a niche game than some of the others are. It may not appeal to everybody, but it is definitely a different but still very World of Darkness feeling play experience.
Well, that's cool, and I'm excited to see where we go with that.
There's a new version of Demon coming out eventually, and
that was a game that was terribly underappreciated in my opinion. I loved that original book, and it felt like nobody knew about it.
What's this book called again?
No,
I'm joking. I'm joking.
And then, without going into details on anything that has not been announced, there is more original product in the pipeline.
So that's something I'm very, very glad to hear, because I actually put in my notes is that it feels like all Onyx Path is doing at this point is just rehashing old stuff and not doing anything new, which, hearing that they've got these announcements that I somehow missed, and stuff in the pipe that's going to be original, that gives me a lot of hope for the World of Darkness again, because I really miss having new content. As much as I love the original stuff, and love seeing it in new deluxe editions. But
they've got a real hard road ahead of them, though, if they want to recapture, if they want to reach the same levels of White Wolf. I think that's going to be a big challenge. But it's really exciting to hear that they are moving forward.
I'm honestly not even sure if reaching the same level as White Wolf is even feasible in the current market. It's just the market itself and the zeitgeist have changed. But if they can even be successful enough to just be one of the big names in the current market, I would be thrilled with that.
That would be cool. I would love to see that happen. And speaking of big names in the market, if we take the Wayback Machine a little further, and we want to talk about horror games,
TSR's Ravenloft.
Yeah, let's crank back to the 80s and talk about Ravenloft.
I got a question for you guys. Have either of you played or run the original Ravenloft module?
I
I6?
have. I got the Sun Sword.
Ooh.
And I defeated
I have not played
him.
or run the original. I am familiar with it. I have read through it multiple times.
I'm on the same level as Ari on this one. I have not played it, but I've read it many times in preparations to run it. It just never got together. This module, every single time anyone does whether it's D&D specific or across the board, greatest modules ever written. This one is almost always in the top 5, if not 1 or 2. So I wanted to talk about what was it about this module that resonated so much with people. Why was it such... Because I know it kind of was something really different from what was going on at the time in D&D.
Well, it really was. It brought a lot of the gothic horror to D&D. It brought the tropes of the old style vampire Dracula to D&D.
It's like a Hammer horror film as a dungeon.
Yeah, and it also brought a lot of flexibility that adventure modules didn't have at the time.
Because it wasn't a point A to point B to point C to point D. Here's the map. You're going to go this way when you define the thing. No, there was... Because I seem to remember that was the thing, was Strahd could show up at almost any point.
Yeah,
right?
there was some randomness to it, even on the DM side. It was a depending on how the fortune telling went at the beginning of the game would determine where you could find Strahd and what his objective was and that sort of thing. And it's been done since then, and I would even say it's been done a couple of times better since then, but it would not have been done without that one. That one, if it wasn't the first, it was certainly the first big release to do anything like that.
And another thing that I always loved about the Ravenloft module was the fact that, as far as I can tell, again, my timeline may be a little bit off because I was 6 years old when the original module came out. I wasn't quite into gaming yet, but it seemed like it was the first major module where the antagonist was a three-dimensional character. He had a history, he had a backstory. He was, in some ways, and this may have come in a little bit later with the novels and the full setting, but he was even presented in that original module with a backstory that made him, even though he was unequivocally an evil character and an antagonist, he was still a little bit sympathetic, and that's something that you never saw before then. Am I right?
Very rarely. And you, by the way, you damn kids, get off my lawn.
Again, you didn't see it too often in D&D before then. I won't go so far as to say never, but it certainly wasn't a common thing. A lot of his sympathetic background did come in later, but you're right, there was a great deal of it even just to start with.
Because they did tell the original background story of murdering his brother to steal his wife.
I think they did. I think so. I mean, it was fairly.
Yeah, it was like 2 paragraphs.
Yeah, fairly non-detailed at the time, but I think it was in there. Yes.
And then, so TSR took the success of this adventure, and when they had this big sort of explosion of campaign settings in the 80s, they decided that Ravenloft would become its own campaign setting and it would actually feature horror as one of the main focuses of its particular niche.
And speaking of something very unique, I actually do know the timeline on this one. Every single other setting, for the most part, it may have played with the trope some. Dragonlance came first, for sure, and Forgotten Realms was a lot different than, say, Greyhawk or Mystar or any of those. But it was the first one, other than Spelljammer beat it by a year, where it came out with something that was just completely different than that standard trope of, like, Tolkien-esque fantasy or heavily Tolkien-inspired fantasy. It did something that was completely different from that. It was, again, Spelljammer came first, but Spelljammer, giant hamsters on a sailing ship in the stars.
There's a lot of things about Spelljammer that I really, really like, and I think we should have a discussion about that sometime. But Ravenloft is definitely distinct. And like Spelljammer, it had something that was really unique in that it was sort of a meta setting in which you could bring characters in from almost anywhere. You could bring characters from Greyhawk or the Forgotten Realms, and it had links and connections to all the other campaign settings, which kind of made all of the Dungeons & Dragons worlds feel connected.
Because a lot of the Dark Lords were brought in from other settings, even if they weren't characters in those settings in the first place.
Absolutely they were.
Now, the funny thing about that is, on the one hand, that is a strength of the setting when it's used properly. On the other, I found, just in my personal experience, at least for me, Ravenloft campaigns, whether I was running them or playing in them, always wound up feeling more satisfying and more atmospheric if we removed the otherworld visitor aspect and just played natives of the setting. Because when you do that, it ceases to become, how do I escape from here? And it becomes more of a just,
how do I survive? This
is how the world is. It's an awful place.
Yeah.
What am I doing here?
Ari, I agree with you that probably builds for a superior experience. But I will say that, like, one of the cool things about Ravenloft, just like one of the points of doing Ravenloft as opposed to something else, is because you can bring in some of those things you love the most about other settings. And I'll give you a great example. Lord Soth from Dragonlance.
Oh, sure.
He was freaking awesome, and having him as part of Ravenloft I thought was a masterstroke.
He was the only character in the history of Ravenloft that beat the Dark Powers.
I think Aslan actually later did too.
Nope, he came damn close, but he never quite did what he was trying to. I think that was right when, again, White Wolf was taking over Ravenloft.
Soth is definitely the pioneer, for sure.
Soth thoroughly beat them, though. It was basically, because the way for those who aren't that familiar with Ravenloft's setting, the Dark Powers are this mysterious force. It may be one thing, it may be multiple things, it may not be an entity, it may be something else. It was very, very vague, but the core of it was, it's DM fiat as a game mechanic in the world, almost. And these powers bring these horrible, horrible people into this plane, into this demi-plane of Ravenloft, and create their own little country for them. And the rules of how things work in that country are built around Twilight Zone-style punishments for their own hubris and evil. For example, the name fell out of my head already. The Lich guy.
Aslan.
Well, there's Aslan, and Vecna is also a Dark Lord, so,
Well, Vecna became a Dark Lord for a time, and he broke. That was the big second edition ending thing, I believe.
But there was multiple Liches, is what I'm getting at.
But But Aslan was one I was specifically thinking of, where his power was he was the greatest mage of all time in his original world, and his thing was learning new magics and learning new spells. So he wanted to conquer his area, and he got the biggest chunk of Ravenloft all to himself in terms of volume-wise, and he is the most powerful wizard in all of Ravenloft.
But he cannot learn anything new ever.
Bingo. That's his punishment. Strahd fell so in love with his brother's betrothed that he set up a plan, and I'm not, it's been a while, I'm not quite sure on the specifics, but he ended up murdering his brother to steal his brother's wife. They weren't married yet at this point, so his brother's about to be wife on his wedding night, went to marry himself, and she killed herself. And he was distraught by this because he was so in love with this woman. And so they pulled the plane over, and he pretty much started the Ravenloft world, which is why it's named after his castle Ravenloft. And he was so in love with her and tortured, and the plane occasionally reincarnates her. And he tries to win over this reincarnation of his beloved. And he fails every single time. And it's that carrot right in front of him where he can never ever find any sort of peace or accomplishment because he can come only so close. And every single time she comes up in some new way that makes him think, maybe this time. And it never happens. And every single one of the planes in Ravenloft had their own Dark Lord who was tortured in this exact same way, in these great ironic punishments for their own crimes.
That's a big part of what made the setting really cool and unique and really work in some ways, is that because the Dark Lords are, in a lot of ways, the Dark Lords are really well done. And the nations that they are in charge of, and the idea that it's a prison, there were many facets of the setting, I think, that are brilliant. I won't say I love everything about it, but there are certainly lots of little pieces of Ravenloft that I think are very well designed.
Well, it's like I was saying earlier about the werewolf, the White Wolf clans, where some of them are really, really appealing to me, and some of them aren't. Some of the nations in Ravenloft are really appealing to me, some of them not so much. But I just absolutely love it. And I was also kind of because I know growing up, pretty much everyone ran the kitchen sink campaign, where it's, okay, Ravenloft is this country, and Forgotten Realms is this country, and Greyhawk's on this country, and it's all on the same planet. And you would mix and match all these campaign settings together. Well, Ravenloft was like that. Each of the little countries in Ravenloft were pulled from another plane. So you'd have one where it was really low medieval technology, and you'd have ones that were like Renaissance level technology. So you could play with those and move the characters from one to the other to experience the different things.
One thing I loved about Ravenloft, too, was that it was transitory. That you could have people visit it and then return to their normal world, and you didn't really need to explain too much about why. And that's what made it perfect for, like, a Halloween game. Like, if you had your own D&D campaign and you were like, hey, let's have a cool special, Halloween-themed game, and we'll all go to Ravenloft and then come back. And you could just do that.
The classic weekend of horror.
And of course, the thing is, once you do that to your gaming group, from then on, anytime in any campaign you so much as mention mist, they freak.
Yeah, good point.
I've loved Ravenloft since I discovered it. It was definitely the first time I really got the impression that the guys at TSR really embraced what I said earlier about you have to have something unknown to really make horror work.
Because that was another thing. And the powers themselves.
The dark powers, yes. Which is why, one of the later Ravenloft novels actually tried to define them. And my understanding is that even TSR itself considered that novel to be non-canonical after it came out.
And we've mentioned that that there's game fiction that kind of supports these horror games, kind of builds on them. I mean, Ari's written game fiction, and White Wolf, as we mentioned earlier, had many books about it. I would say Ravenloft actually had a pretty high percentage of pretty decent books for its particular world.
Yeah, I can only think of a couple off the top of my head that were, I read them and I'm like, nah. All of them were at least pretty good up into amazingly well written.
Well, there's the ones about Lord Soth. I remember I really enjoyed those, and there was Strahd, which I really liked. Those are the ones that I can remember.
Yeah, Eistrad was P. and Elrod, who
That's right.
was well known for her own she was writing urban fantasy before urban fantasy was kind of a thing. A specific subgenre of its own. She came around from I think she started in the late 80s, and they brought her in to write this book, and it was one of the best written fantasy tie-in books especially for that sort of horror genre. It's right up there with the Dragonlance Chronicles and all those.
Now, do you think, Ari, this is a good question for you. Do you think that Ravenloft as a setting, does it still work for new players?
Oh, absolutely. Well, there's a reason that it has come up in one form or another in every edition since it was introduced. I think that it still speaks to people. It's still, the classic tropes still work very well as an atmospheric shorthand, as a basis for stories. I think the problem is figuring out how to use it. I mean, as both... Okay, even on a personal level, Ravenloft has kind of been my white whale professionally. 'Cause, when it was out in 2nd edition, I wasn't in the industry. In 3rd edition, White Wolf licensed it for a while.
That's right.
And I finally got a chance to work on the line, and it was in what turned out to be the very last White Wolf Ravenloft book. So I didn't get to do anything else with it. That book didn't really pick up very much. Went back to Wizards of the Coast. A few years later, Wizards of the Coast was doing a new Ravenloft fiction line called Ravenloft Dominion. And the idea was...
Oh, this is where one of your books comes from, isn't that right?
Sort of.
Yeah.
The idea was it was Ravenloft, but with a step back from Dungeons & Dragons. It was Ravenloft drawing characters not from D&D settings, but from different periods in Earth history.
This is where Black Crusade comes from.
Yes, I was contracted to write a book called Black Crusade, which was going to be the first of the new Ravenloft books. And then it got pushed back because I was also writing the first of the Planeswalker novels for Magic the Gathering. The brand team, for understanding that the Planeswalker novels were a big deal for them, they wanted that to be my first book for them because, what if the Ravenloft book comes out and it doesn't do well and then bookstores don't want to order as many of the Magic book? So, okay, I'm disappointed, but I can suck that up. So I'm not going to be the first Ravenloft book out after all. Problem is, after 2 or 3 novels, the line was canceled.
Because that was right during the the kind of reshuffle they did in the middle of 4th edition, where they switched to Essentials and...
no, this was well before that.
Oh, this before even that?
Yes, this is well before that. No, this was just my understanding, narrowed down to the parts that I know I can talk about publicly, is that the reprints of old Ravenloft novels had not done as well as hoped, so the bookstores were not ordering as many of the new Dominion novels as would have been necessary.
Good old publishing industry.
And then Hasbro handed down the edict to focus more on the core lines, so the Ravenloft line was canceled before my novel got released. So what eventually happened is we stuck it online. It is still available out there as a free PDF download, basically as sort of an advertisement for my Magic the Gathering novel. So I sort of did and didn't get to publish a Ravenloft novel.
Now, because you were working on 4th edition probably around this time, I believe, they had announced that, because they were, at the time in 4th edition, were releasing one campaign setting per cycle with the tie-in adventures, and then, because they started with, I believe, Forgotten Realms, then went to Eberron, then Dark Sun, and next up, Ravenloft, and then all of a sudden, we're doing something called Shadowfell instead.
Yeah, and that was the third my third attempt at the White Whale.
Oh, I was so upset when that got dropped. I was looking forward to that.
I had written an adventure for inclusion in the Ravenloft box set, and a second one for use on Ravenloft game day events. And as you said, that got shuffled back and then canceled as well. So basically 3 different times I have had a chance to work on Ravenloft, and then because of timing, it either didn't get released or didn't get released as it should have been and didn't go anywhere. I am still itching for a real shot at Ravenloft.
I'm putting my foot down now, Wizards of the Coast. I know you're getting in contact with some of the people who have handled previous editions for their campaign settings, hopefully to involve them in next. I know you've been in contact with Ed Greenwood. I know you've been in contact with Keith Baker for Eberron. Get Ari Marmell on Ravenloft this time. God damn you.
I am Ari Marmell, and I support this message.
Yeah, that's one of the things I just flat out love this setting. And one of the reasons why I wanted to ask the question of, will this still work in the modern day, is because Gothic horror, for the most part, kind of isn't a thing anymore. They've moved on to using some of the same tropes in urban fantasy, and they kind of get stripped away to the point where you've got Vampire Diaries and True Blood are your vampires in fiction right now.
So don't forget Twilight.
I didn't forget. I omitted intentionally.
But that's the thing, though, is that these things go in cycles.
Because I know they're about to... I think they're doing another Frankenstein film.
They are.
And there is really no doubt in my mind that, it'll never look the same each time it comes back around. But the Gothic tropes will come back around.
Well, Gothic, though, isn't just the only place you can find horror in RPGs. And I think it's a good time for us, actually, to probably talk about another big name in RPGs, which is Call of Cthulhu.
Oh, yeah, this is a game that's really, really popular. I really like, but I don't understand why it's so popular to actually play the game, because part of Lovecraftian horror in general is the feeling of inevitability, and the best you're going to be able to do as a hero in a Lovecraft novel is possibly even sacrificing your sanity or your life to stave off the end of the world for another week.
Well, that's the thing that Call of Cthulhu kind of offers, though, that is unique about it as a game, is that you are playing characters that are not necessarily following the same adventuring paradigm that you do in almost every other game. You kind of know that you're playing Call of Cthulhu only for a limited time, right? You're maybe staving off midnight, another 5 minutes, if you're lucky. And there's something kind of cool and attractive about that in some ways. The only times I've ever really enjoyed Call of Cthulhu was as short, limited campaigns where we didn't just play for years and years like we did with a lot of other games. But I think that was intentional. I think that's because that's what Call of Cthulhu offered us.
Well, and I think that's actually a very good way to do a lot of the horror games. The best Call of Cthulhu games I've been part of, the best Ravenloft games I've been part of, have all been basically mini campaigns. We're going to play this for 3 or 5 or 7 sessions, and the story will be over. And it's the same thing here with Call of Cthulhu, especially if you're dealing with mostly with, you start with the crazy cultists and don't bring in the gibbering horrors from beyond time until the last game of the campaign.
It is also one of the very few settings that actually celebrates the 1920s era.
Yes.
You don't really carry around Tommy guns or gas lamps.
That's actually changing a lot because pulp is a big thing in independent role-playing right now. I know of at least 5 pulp adventure games set in the 20s in various different subgenres thereof.
That may be
coming
true
out
now.
right now.
Yeah.
And that's just recently. Call of Cthulhu's been around since, I think it was late 80s again, wasn't it?
It's 80s, certainly. But I'm saying, during its heyday, certainly, during its introduction, that's another thing, that's another reason why you would play Call of Cthulhu instead of some other game, is because it gave you a chance to play in a setting that was maybe not unique, but definitely different than many of the other offerings.
And it also gave you a chance to step into the roles of these non-heroic characters, per se. You would play a librarian, an archaeologist.
Yeah.
The biggest you would get in terms of actual action hero type person is you might play the Private Eye.
Exactly.
Even still then, you're digging around looking for stuff, and that's one of the things, I think they got the theme dead on of the Lovecraftian novels, is that, at least to me, and I may be wrong on this, I haven't read everything Lovecraft has written. I've read probably about a third to a half of all the short stories and novels, but
don't forget his romance book, by the way, if you're going to go all out. I'm just saying.
No thanks. But it always seemed to me that kind of like the core message behind, not all of them, but a lot of them were, curiosity killed the cat. if you would just leave it alone.
Ignorance is bliss.
It's when you start digging around, it's like, oh, what's this thing? This leads me to this thing. And, okay, I'm now scratching the back of my head until it bleeds for no reason because this is so disturbing to me, but I must find out more. And it kind of led to that. The more you look into it, the more it hurts you. And that's a core human drive, is to find out unanswered questions, especially ones that should not be answered.
In Call of Cthulhu, it's the one game where it's actually a strength to play a character who can't read, or to play a character who's blind. Either one of those two character types, you're probably going to survive longer.
Now, of course, the thing about Call of Cthulhu is that it is atmospheric, and it does capture a lot of the Lovecraftian. At the same time, you listen to people talk about playing it, and at least in my experience, 8 times out of 10... it's going to end up with shotguns and dynamite.
Well, isn't that true of games in general?
Well, yes. But I think there's only so far that even the most atmospheric game can, and I mean this with all affection because I count myself among them. There's only so far you can go before you're stuck with the fact that you're still dealing with gamers.
Well, yeah. Well,
we went into that a lot in the last episode as well.
The thing about Call of Cthulhu is, though, that the stories you tell about games of Call of Cthulhu are very different than the stories you tell about other games. Like, if you tell a story about Dungeons & Dragons, you're telling about this great triumph you had where you slayed the vampire king.
Call of Cthulhu is always about, and this ended horribly for us.
Yeah, the stories you tell in Call of Cthulhu are, how horribly we died, And it's still entertaining.
Or how crazy you went and the weird shit you did under the guise of, okay, I read this book and now I'm completely gibbering mess.
Yeah, half of those stories start with, and then I lost more sand points and picked up, a madness.
Now, there's one thing else I wanted to touch on with Call of Cthulhu specifically is there are a lot of Lovecraftian-themed games, and some of them start doing cross-genre stuff with it, and one of the ones that I've always found most fascinating is one that I've never actually played, but I want to so bad. It's Cthulhu Punk.
I knew you were going to say that.
You mean Cthulhu Tech?
No, Cthulhu Punk, which was a GURPS supplement that crossed cyberpunk with Lovecraftian mythos stuff.
Well, that's also true in Cthulhu Tech, but yes, fair enough.
Or do I have the wrong name?
Cthulhu Tech is not a GURPS supplement, so you must be thinking of Cthulhu Punk.
Okay. But it possibly, because I always thought Cthulhu Tech was more mecha.
It is. Based. It is, absolutely is.
Because Cthulhu Punk is not. Cthulhu Punk is closer to Shadowrun than it is Battletech.
Ah, okay, fair enough.
For sure. But either way, it goes into the same thing where it's. I'm going to take a step back and do what seems like a divergence, but it has a point that ties in, I promise. There's an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer that I fucking love. It is the 2-part where Angel loses his soul and becomes Angelus. And yes, I love that part of it, but there's another aspect to it is the big bad in that little 2-parter was a demon known as the Judge. The Judge was such a powerful demon that no weapon forged by man could destroy him. And the big threat was Spike and Drusilla were trying to reassemble the part. It took armies to come together and sunder him into 5 parts, and Drusilla and Spike were putting him back together to destroy the world. And then Angelus comes along, and because of him, succeeds. And this demon is running rampage, and meanwhile Buffy's in this bad headspace because she just lost her virginity to her first love, which caused him to turn into a complete psychopath.
I hate when that happens.
And that was just the brilliance of Whedon's storytelling. But anyway, the point of it is the climax of that 2-parter, which, again, spoiler alert for something that's over a decade old. Watch the goddamn thing already. Anyway, the climax is they're at a shopping mall, and the Judge is tearing things apart, and then Buffy shows up, and the Judge says, "No weapon forged by man can kill me." And then she picks up a fucking rocket launcher and says, "That was then, this is now." Angelus and Drusilla split and run away because they know what's going on. Judge tilts his head and says, "What's that?" And he gets blown into chunky salsa because, and this brings me back to Cthulhu Punk, is it brings in this idea to the Lovecraft mythos of descriptive versus proscriptive prophecy. The prophecy in that episode was descriptive. It described that no weapon forged by man at that point in time could destroy him. It wasn't proscriptive, saying that no weapon forged by man at any point in history in the future will be able to kill him. The ancient cults wrote down that he was not able to be killed by swords and shields, which a lot of the ancient cults in Call of Cthulhu, they could not be killed by swords and shields and things like that. Then you get into, well, what's this squidgely, squirmy thing from beyond the stars going to deal with a fully automatic grenade launcher with a smart link or a monomolecular blade powered by a cybernetic arm? So it really brings that idea is, okay, how does this work? And I really think that's something that would be really cool to explore.
There's also another crossover, I believe it's called Eldritch Stars, and it's a fairly recent one. It's kind of like a space exploration RPG, almost like Traveler or Flash Gordon maybe, and that also involves the mythos. Now, I'm not real familiar with it, so obviously, I'm just sort of mentioning it as another type of crossover that you may not have heard of.
Does anyone else have anything else to say about Call of Cthulhu and Lovecraftian themed role-playing?
Well, I'm just wondering, just real quick bit of trivia, which, you guys are both gamers, so you may already know this, but are you familiar with the story behind the Cthulhu mythos appearing in the first printing of Deities and Demigods?
Are you talking about the full story behind the scenes, or are you talking about just the story itself if they printed it and had to recall it?
Oh no, I mean the behind the scenes tale with the whole with the disclaimer and whatnot.
I know, I have heard this story, but it is a great story, and I would love to hear you tell it.
Yes, Ari, please tell us the story.
Okay, well,
as a storyteller.
Once upon a time, no. The very first printing of the first edition Deities and Demigods for Dungeons and Dragons included, among others, they had the various pantheons of, Earth mythology, the Olympians, the Egyptian gods, whatnot.
And also of Nawan.
Yes. But it also included the Cthulhu mythos in the very first printing. That book came out, and Chaosium, who already had at that point, had the rights for Call of Cthulhu and whatnot, kind of tapped them on the shoulder and said, hey, guys. And the eventual agreement was that Chaosium would say, okay, you guys can keep printing the book with these in it, but we want something on the credits page saying, Cthulhu mythos used with permission of Chaosium.
I just want to step in one moment and I've heard a slightly different version of this story.
Okay.
Where they printed Deities and Demigods, and then Gary Gygax called Chaosium and said, hey, we printed this book with the Cthulhu mythos, and you're stepping on intellectual property rights with your things. It's like, oh, so you contacted the Lovecraft estate and got the rights? Let me call you back.
See, that detail I hadn't heard, but that's interesting. Okay. But either way, the agreement was that they could keep doing it as long as they had this notice on the credits page, which makes sense because, at the time, Chaosium was much smaller than TSR. It's basically free advertising. Come the time of, I think, the third printing, management at TSR decided, well, we don't want to be advertising for our competition, and we're not going to do that anymore. So we're going to strip the Cthulhu mythos out of the books, which is why the third printing onward didn't have them. Except they stripped out the chapter. They did not strip out the credit.
Whoops.
So there is at least one printing, maybe more, of Deities and Demigods that does not have Cthulhu in it, but still has on the credits page Cthulhu mythos used by permission of Chaosium.
Huh. That's interesting.
Confused the hell out of me as a kid.
Yeah, which one of these is supposed to be Cthulhu again?
Yeah, right.
Is that Corellon the Rethian? No, yeah, that's an interesting story. But yeah, so we have talked about White Wolf, which was the most recent, probably the biggest influential publisher of horror RPGs. We've talked about Ravenloft, sort of the granddaddy, and we've talked about Call of Cthulhu, which is another of those big titan pillars of horror RPGs. What are some other horror RPGs that you guys can think of that we want to talk about before we wrap up?
I know of one that's going to be coming out very, very soon. I don't really know much about the guy who made it, but it's called Cursed.
Well, technically, I would have to say Accursed is actually more of a dark fantasy setting than it is a horror setting, because the tropes of Accursed are really more about the, sort of Solomon Kane, I'm a monster hunter fighting other monsters, rather than, exploring that deep personal horror, or exploring cosmic horror, or exploring even the idea of just sort of creeping you out. Although we did try and make the monsters as creepy as possible, it's not. I wouldn't say Accursed really is a horror RPG at the end of the day. I would say it's action. I would say it's a dark fantasy, is what I would say.
Well, you could also make the same arguments about World of Darkness as well. In that case, because it's kind.
Yeah, but the intention is different than the execution. My intention with Accursed was not to be horror. The intention with World of Darkness was to be horror.
But the reason why I wanted to bring it up is to plug your new product.
Oh, and thank you.
and to be it, even if it isn't necessarily horror, it definitely plays on the same tropes as horror, classic horror books and films.
Yeah, Hammer horror films and things like that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Accursed does play with a lot of those tropes. And yeah, if you want to play, monsters that team up together to fight witches, that is absolutely the right game for you. So yes, and definitely check us out at AccursedRPG.com, and you can find our successful Kickstarter page by searching for Accursed RPG on Kickstarter. So thank you for the plug. I really appreciate it.
And I think honestly, and this is an entirely different podcast by itself, but you just touched on something that I've argued before, which is that horror and fantasy, they're the same genre, just looked at from two different angles. That's an interesting perspective.
Whether or not the heroes are able to tackle the challenge.
I mean, there's a little more to it than that, but yes, you talk about boiling things down to the tropes, and I'm a huge fan of using classic tropes, but I would argue that it's not even that you have to, it's not even that you have to change them slightly. You can take the exact same story and tell it as a fantasy or a horror.
Well, a mind flayer is a pretty fucking scary thing when you actually break it down and think about it.
Exactly. That was one of the things that we tried, not as successfully as I would have liked, but at least somewhat okay to deal with in the 3rd edition D&D Heroes of Horror book, was talking about how to take fantasy creatures that are considered to be just challenges to overcome and make them horrific. Anyway, that's a sidetrack, but you just got me thinking. But no, as far as other horror role-playing games, most of my experience has been with those three: White Wolf, Ravenloft, Call of Cthulhu. I did play a game of Cult once.
Ooh, Cult. Yeah, that's one I haven't heard of in a long time.
That's one where I can see how things could have gotten really weird if we'd kept playing. We only got the one game in, so I can't really give an opinion on it. I'm just mentioning it because, yes, I have played it.
Well, Daryl was talking about, he really enjoyed the idea of mixing horror and some cyberpunk type elements.
Mm-hmm.
There was a game I think he would have really, really liked, Dark Conspiracy.
I have heard of that name before, but that's about all I know of it. I think I remember seeing a catalog ad for it or something like that.
Well, the games are well out of print, but there is it was actually supported by a very strong trilogy by Mike Stackpole. If you're interested in reading game fiction for it sometime, it's very, very good. And Dark Conspiracy, I thought, was a neat horror game, a horror RPG setting. It definitely, puts you in the role of investigators, learning more about, the horrible things that lurk beyond our reality. But it added in some of the corruptive elements of things like Call of Cthulhu without straying into the whole idea of sanity loss. I'm not an expert on it by any means, but it was very neat. I definitely own a couple of books for it, and I just want to recommend it as something for people to, if they're interested in researching more about horror RPGs in general, that would be one I would say you should look at.
Okay, and I am now also going to plug something.
Hooray!
Please do.
I'll bring it back to gaming in just a second. Myself, James Gates, and C.A. Suleiman have been putting together basically an almost Thieves World style shared world fantasy anthology called Tales of the Lost Citadel. And this is effectively dark fantasy / horror fantasy. The conceit is it is set in a single city, much as Thieves World was.
Sanctuary.
But in this case, it is the last city. It is a fantasy world in which nobody knows what happened. Maybe the gods went mad. The gates of hell broke down. We basically took a fantasy setting and subjected it to a zombie apocalypse. We don't call it that in the book, but that's what it is.
Wow.
This city is literally the last bastion in a world that is overrun with the undead. But the undead are used primarily... They're not actually the story focus. They're sort of a background. They're what we use to explain why the city exists as it is.
And I could give a lecture on why that's the right approach to do for an undead horde.
But, so we have the idea the city is multiple cultures trying to mix, multiple races trying to mix, different castes, different classes, poverty, suffering, horror. Anybody who dies needs to be disposed of because they could rise. It's basically, as we call it, we've been putting it as this is a Tolkien fantasy that has been torn down to a Howard or Lieber fantasy. High fantasy made low fantasy via horror.
Nice.
And while right now it is a fiction anthology with a number of writers we're talking to, we are talking to people about doing a role-playing game attached to it.
Well, Ari, I just want to mention that I am available for hire for both fiction and game design. So just letting you know.
Okay. Well, I will keep you guys informed how it's going. Anybody who wants to check it out, we have a page up. It's a Facebook page, but it's public, so I don't think you have to be a Facebook member. Just look for Lost Citadel on Facebook, and you'll get an idea of the basic mood and feel and theme we're going for.
It sounds really cool, Ari. I wish you all the luck with that. I hope that turns out really well for you guys.
Thank you.
And, we're going to have to wrap up here shortly, but I just want to mention a last couple of games that we have talked about previously on the podcast. We talked about Nightlife, which was the kind of proto-World of Darkness. And we talked about, we may not have talked about it before, but we should talk about it now. Also, Deadlands is an interesting look at horror role-playing, although it's, slightly less horror, slightly more action maybe than some of the other ones we've talked about tonight.
I don't even think I want to describe it this way because the movie was so bad, but one of the ways that it's always been explained to me is it's kind of in a way Jonah Hex.
Well, Jonah Hex the character rather than the film, but yes, absolutely. It's very Jonah Hex in a way, yeah. In fact, I had a friend of mine played a character who was basically Jonah Hex in Deadlands, so those are some games that if any of our listeners are interested in finding out more about horror RPGs in general, that's what they should check out. Now, if they're interested in finding out more about Ari Marmell and what Ari Marmell is up to, where should they go?
They can check either mouseferatu.com, which is MOUSEFERATU, or if that's too silly to remember, just arimarmell.com, take you to the same place.
All right. And what is your newest thing? Besides Tales from Lost City, what is your newest thing?
The next thing coming out in 2 months is the third Wittersham's book, and then early next year is Hot Lead, Cold Iron, which is the first of the 1930s noir fantasies. And the first of hopefully many.
And you also have an ebook coming out soon, don't you?
Yes.
Kickstarter?
A collection of short fiction, both reprint and original stuff, called Strange New Words.
Outstanding. And once again, we want to thank you, Ari, for joining us on episode 5 of You All Meet in a Tavern. Right now, I see that there's Imperial Guardsmen poking their heads in. Usually they do that right before the tavern closes for the night, so we're going to have to wrap this up. But it has been a real pleasure having you on the show with us, and we appreciate you taking the time out to talk to us about horror and games.
Thanks for the invite.
Thank you once again for joining us at the Gamers Tavern. Wait, that's different than what I called the podcast at the start of the show, isn't it? There's going to be a big announcement on our website at gamerstavern.org in just a day or two, so make sure you drop by. And while you're there, you can support the show by leaving a comment or visiting our sponsors. You can also review us on iTunes, and your comments and reviews might just get read on air. Next week, our topic will be technology in gaming with guest Jason Marker. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons non-commercial, no derivatives 3.0 license, except where noted in the show notes. Thank you again for listening, and until next time, the tavern is closed.